My name is Cassandra Wiley. I'm one of your Honors Teaching Fellows for Honors 251, and today we're going to be talking about moderating. Before we can talk about how to be an effective moderator, we first have to talk about what is moderating. So moderating is just the process of encouraging and facilitating discussion among participants. That being said, your job as a moderator is not to participate in discussion directly. However, it is to encourage and bolster up your participants to have an effective discussion and discuss the options at length in order to decide on an action. So being you are not participating, your goal is to use as little I think and I feel statements as possible. You also want to encourage your participants to participate. An example of this would be doing something like after a participant shares an idea, you can reinforce that by saying, that's a great point, would anyone like to add? Or that's a wonderful point. Are there any drawbacks of that potential action? So you want to reinforce participation and in a way praise your participants for sharing. One of the differences between a good and a great moderator is actually being able to gauge the flow of the conversation. So if you see that people are super into what they're talking about, you should build accordingly. Obviously, then every individual statement does not need reinforcing. Participants will then start bouncing off of one another, and it shows that they're actually engaged in discussion. But another thing that makes a great moderator is actually being able to stray away from using your prep sheet. There is a guide on how to moderate, but if you're just reading from that document and using only those example questions, then your moderation experience is going to be kind of stagnant. It's going to be kind of awkward, and it doesn't flow very well. Another thing is you don't want to freeze up. Moderating can be a very intimidating experience. A lot of people have a fear of public speaking, but know that as a moderator, the focus is not on you. You are just there to be like, all right, we've spent enough time talking about this, let's move on. Or, addressing the participants directly. Thank you guys so much for participating. I've really enjoyed discussion. Does anyone else have anything they would like to add before we move on to the next action? So sample things like that just to talk about. One thing that students struggle with is when it comes to whether they agree or disagree with a participant. As I like to say, your job is to remain radically neutral. Your opinion does not necessarily matter in this discussion. Obviously, if someone is being bigoted, using slurs or hate speech, then you will want to shut that down in a nice manner. Indicate in the rules that you'll be talking about. You have a list of rules that you'll be reading from. And, say that everything has to be respectful. We're all here to just talk about some options, that this is not a debate, that we are not fighting one another. That is very important. We're not talking about the issue itself. For example, if we had a group talking about climate change and how to reverse the effects, we would not be talking about whether or not climate change is real. That is not the point of the discussion. The discussion is about what can we do to lessen the impacts of climate change. And that will be talking about encouraging recycling, introducing tax breaks for companies, things like that. So we're not talking about the issue itself. We are not debating climate change. We're discussing the validity of actions as to reducing the impact of climate change. So if you had someone that did come in and they were like, I think we should do nothing about climate change, and you don't want to reinforce them by saying, oh, well, I agree, that's a wonderful point. You can have these subtle nuances in the way that you address your participants that makes it seem like you are supporting them, when in reality, you are just praising them for their participation. So if someone said, I think that the fault all lies within the citizens, that the citizens are the whole reason that climate change exists, instead of saying, that's a good point, would anyone like to build on that? You can instead say something, that's an interesting point. Would anyone have anything they would like to add or counter? So you're still seeming like you're saying the exact same thing, but you've added a subtle nuance. That way you don't have to lie about whether or not you agree with the participant or not. Next, we're going to be talking about some troubleshooting tips. One thing that often happens is students get silent groups where nobody's wanting to participate. And this is where having your personal stake question in the very beginning helps a lot. You can refer back to that with each option. So if it turns into an echo chamber where everybody agrees with everything or they have nothing they want to add, you can ask about a particular option. Hey, how would that influence you personally? So back to the climate change example. If it was talking about how encouraging recycling or introducing tax breaks for those who recycle X amount of bottle or X amount of whatever, then that way you could ask them, well, with regards to your personal state question, how would having to recycle every day influence your day-to-day life? So being able to almost connect with them on a personal level, and that is a wonderful way to facilitate discussion. If you're stuck in an echo chamber, you can ask someone to be devil's advocate. That can be really hard for a lot of groups, and for some topics that is actually not possible. But for the climate change example, just to stay with one example the entire duration of this video, if you were asked someone to play devil's advocate about the climate change, and so the action was to introduce tax breaks for citizens who recycle a certain amount within a year, the question would be, how would we pay that? Or what would that mean for the economy? So oftentimes asking how would we get funding for our actions for this option is a wonderful way to spark discussion among individuals. And, many people will tend to disagree or have different ideas about where funding should come from. So that is one way to utilize a question to get out of a silent group. The goal of moderating is not to agree or disagree. So you're discussing how to necessarily fix the issue, but this is a wicked problem, so there is no easy answer, and that is the goal, to talk about things that can help either bring awareness to the issue or downplay or lessen the effects of the issue. So it's not about whether what's happening is right or wrong. When you have one or two people dominating the conversation, again, you still want to reinforce your participant. You do not want them to feel like they're being targeted for talking too much. They may just really be passionate and have a lot they want to say, which is totally fine and acceptable. You just want to bolster up the other additional participants and means of doing so. So if I had a participant who was dominating the conversation and they were just constantly adding things about things that we could do for climate change, you would reinforce them saying, that's a great point. I had not thought of that. What did the other participants think about that? And then that would give them a chance to talk about something that a participant has added. That way it's not just those one or two people talking. Everyone has to give their input, or even asking how many people agree with the potential action this person has proposed. Or if you have a person who's dominating the conversation who is adding additional information, again, reinforce them. Say, I'm so glad that you know a lot about this topic. However, we do need to stick to what's in the issue guide, as that's what we all have read, and that is the common ground that we are approaching from. So even if someone shows up with a whole bunch of statistics about climate change, we want to direct participants to only talk about what is in the issue guide, as that is the common knowledge that participants should have, as we all have the same issue guide. If this persists, again, try drawing back to the personal stake. The personal stake question is very personal to each participant, and another participant usually will not jump in on another person's personal stake. So if my personal stake is that I live on the coast, and if the ocean levels continue to rise, I'll lose my home, someone who's been oversharing is not going to take away from my personal stake. So that can be another great way. So pay attention during your personal stake questions. As noted in the assignment prompt, you will be taking notes, and you will have to take notes over discussion. This can be a hard task to juggle. What I encourage students to do is just take bulleted lists. You can always go back and flush out your notes as much as you want after the fact, but right now taking bulleted points, so that way you're not constantly writing down and the participants feel neglected. Obviously, if they're jumping back and forth with one another constantly, then you don't necessarily have to worry about keeping your eye contact or seeming like nodding along like you're listening, actively listening. You can still take notes, and being there so invested in conversation with one another, how you're presenting at that moment will not make that much of a difference. If you want to later reference something a particular participant has said, a good thing to do is actually just use an initial. So everybody's going to introduce themselves in the beginning. So, if I have a girl named Catherine, if I want to address Catherine in my notes, I'll just put down a C and then later go back and fully edit her full name. If you have two participants with the same letter of their first name, just make one up for another. So if I have a Catherine and a Kathy, but they both start with C, Kathy has more of a K sound, so I would use a K for Kathy. Another responsibility of a moderator is to keep track on time. Obviously, you want to be subtle about this. You don't want to be staring at your phone or staring at your watch during the entire time, but you do want to be conscious about how much time you're spending, as some groups are very limited. Tuesday, Thursday, you're going to have a little bit more leniency with how much time you're going to have, but the Monday, Wednesday, Friday groups, you guys are pretty pressed for time, so definitely be aware of how much time you're using. The hosts will be giving about 2-minute warnings, so they will tell you about when you should be moving on to your next topic. It can be hard to transition sometimes, but you will notice as a moderator, you may not notice it now, but you will find points where there is a transition period that you will see, oh my gosh, this is a great stopping point, or if somebody addresses something from another option after talking for a while, that tends to happen. They're like, I agree with this, but I disagree with this, and that is addressed in the next option. So be like, thank you for your point, Catherine. That's actually addressed in the next option. So since you've already brought that to the table, why don't we go ahead and move on to option 2? So that is a seamless way to change the topic of discussion. If you notice that you're getting close to ending on time and everybody's still super riled up and ready to go, that is a wonderful opportunity to give them a call to action. Remind them that discussion does not end here, that if we're talking about climate change, the effects of climate change don't leave the room when we do, that you can encourage them to write to their senators or lawmakers, continue to share information with their peers, get involved with groups dealing with the issue on a day-to-day basis. So there are ways to end the discussion without seeming abrupt. That it's like, all right, we have 2 minutes left, but I encourage all of you to go out, share what you've learned, continue to learn more, and try to help out this issue in any way that you can. So these are just a couple of my tips for moderating. Sorry this video is a little bit longer, but I hope it will sincerely help all of you. I'm excited to see all of you get your moderation certificates. And if you have any further questions, myself, the other teaching fellows, Professor Roderick Mall and Professor Thompson, we all would be loving to help you. Just a friendly reminder, there is no class on Monday or Tuesday of next week. So have any questions, you can always watch people moderate. The presidential debate of 2020, there was a moderator present there. You can see how they gauged conflict and how they talked about arranging certain issues. So there are resources out there to help you if you feel like this video was not enough. But have a safe Thanksgiving break and travel safely.